Hello and welcome to Aspects of History. I'm Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor. If you're new to Aspects of History, we're a magazine and website dedicated to history and historical fiction. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com where you'll find articles, interviews, book reviews and short stories, and they're all absolutely free. Our magazine is at the insanely cheap price of under a tenner for a year's subscription, and that's under a tenner in American as well. Anyway, on to the podcast. If you enjoy it, please give it a great rating. It'll help us carry on running them. In today's podcast, our first, we are very fortunate to have the acclaimed historian Roger Moorhouse join us. He's the author of First to Fight, a brilliant account of the first days of World War II. The war began on this week in 1939, and whilst everyone here in the UK knows about Britain's declaration of war, the Nazi and Soviet invasions of Poland is less well known. Roger's book is very important. He explodes myths and uncovers staggering brutality by the two totalitarian powers. This podcast is part one, in which Roger sets the scene, describing the first few days and the Nazi advance. In part two, out next week, Roger goes on to talk about what the Poles went through, with numerous atrocities committed by the Nazis and Soviets. I do hope you enjoy our discussion, and please give us a great rating if you do. Okay, so Roger Moorhouse, welcome to Aspects of History, our first podcast, Roger. So that's a bit of an event for us.
Fabulous. I'm delighted to hear it, on.
So today we're going to be talking about your book, which has actually been out, I think, for nearly 18 months or so?
2 years, actually. It came out on the 80th anniversary of the events it describes, and we're now at the 82nd anniversary. So 2 years, almost exactly.
Great. So the book we're talking about, First to Fight, which is the account of the invasion of Poland by the Germans and the Russians. First to Fight. And in the US, you just told me actually it's a different title.
Yeah, in the US it's called Poland 1939, but it's the same book.
Okay. So we have a number of questions for you. So Roger, first off, I mean, it does cover, though, as I say, it covers the Nazi and Soviet invasion of Poland in September 1939. What inspired you to write about this, well, really the first major event of the war?
Partly that it is a big event, and it's one that sort of traditionally gets ignored. And that is the sort of key to my fascination with this subject. I have a sort of a horror of doing the subjects that everyone else has already done. Far too much history, and particularly popular history, in my opinion, is kind of sort of regurgitates what's been done before and adds a sort of a slightly different spin or a slightly different gloss, but is essentially the same narrative. So you've got competing books on Dunkirk or the blessed Dam Busters raid. And that's all well and good, but that's not what I want to do. I'd rather try and find subjects that are, as relevant or more relevant and more significant, certainly more significant than the Dam Busters raid. And at the same time, they're stories that haven't been told or haven't been told sort of, well enough or coherently enough. And I think this fell very, very squarely into that category. The September campaign is the opening campaign of the war. It's the event that brings Britain and France into the war, makes World War II happen in Europe. And in the process, a country is destroyed. It's invaded by its two totalitarian neighbours and is systematically destroyed. That story in itself should warrant telling and retelling over and over again, but strangely it doesn't. So the September campaign really doesn't really feature in most of the standard histories of the war. You can read them and you might have a couple of pages, maybe sometimes even a couple of paragraphs only about the September campaign, and then that's about it. And it has always struck me that there's a much bigger story behind it than those couple of pages or those couple of paragraphs permit. So that's why I wanted to research it and try and tell that story, and crucially to give the Poles their voice, because they've been almost completely absent from that narrative. It's been written largely from the German perspective, where it has been written at all. And the Poles are just sort of shadowy, two-dimensional, victims, nameless figures, really. And I wanted to give the Poles back their voice. So I've sort of used a lot of diaries and archival accounts, of individuals, whether they be soldiers, civilians, everything else, to really try and bring that alive.
And you certainly have, actually. It's I mean, I find it such a riveting book. I mean, starting off, the invasion began in the early hours of the 1st of September, 39. But I think the evening before, which you introduced the invasion with, it's an extraordinary tale. Even even those few hours in the evening. Would you mind just letting us know a little bit about that?
Yeah, what you're referring to is the sort of infamous Gleiwitz incident, which happens just after 8 o'clock on the evening of the 31st of August 1939. And it was the culmination, really, of a sort of a summer of what we'd now, I suppose, call border provocation. So the Germans had been kind of prodding the Poles repeatedly, and I found it fascinating. Actually, found the files in the German archive. They had all of these. They identified lots of buildings, isolated buildings, farmhouses, barns, and so on, close to the German-Polish border, but on the German side. And a lot of these, so there's all these sort of maps and hand-drawn maps of where these buildings are, and each one has, a sort of almost like a scheme of, how many people live there, and so, the details of what the building is. And then over that summer, all of these buildings mysteriously go up in flames. Every couple of nights, another one goes up in flames. And of course, the German press blames the Poles and says it's Poles coming over the border and doing these dreadful things, because they're trying to sort of keep prodding the Poles and always, in one sense, to try and provoke a response, but also to try and make Poland essentially look like the bad guy. This is basic sort of totalitarian techniques. So trying to make Poland look as the villain of the piece, so that it will undermine Poland's international alliances, its international friendships, and so on. So this has been going on all the way through that summer of 1939, and it culminates in there's a couple of other operations at the same time, but Gleiwitz is really the big one. And Gleiwitz was a similar one. Gleiwitz was then in Germany. It's now called Gliwice, and it's in southwestern Poland, but then it was in Germany. It was about 5 kilometers from the Polish border. And it's a reasonably big city. And what the plan was, that there was this SS squad that went down there a few days beforehand, and they were given the job of raiding a German radio station in Gleiwitz, posing as Poles, making some sort of incendiary broadcast over the airwaves, firing a few shots in the air and disappearing into the night. And this was supposedly to be the sort of the crowning Polish provocation of that summer of provocations, false flag provocations anyway, that would give Hitler his excuse to launch the war and say, as he did the following day on the 1st of September, he announced to the Reichstag, "No, we are now firing back." And he's referring to Gleiwitz. He's saying that these dastardly Poles have attacked us yet again, so we are honor bound to fire back. And he describes what happens, the invasion, as we are fighting back. So it gives him his excuse. But it's a remarkable story because, of course, those SS men are attacking a German radio station with German radio staff who are none the wiser. They don't know what's going on. They are rounded up and pushed into the cellar. And the SS try and make their announcement over the airwaves, which doesn't really work. It fails. It would be quite comical, actually. The whole story would be rather comical were it not for the fact that the crowning piece of evidence that this was of Polish authorship of the Gleiwitz incident was that they left the body of a Polish activist behind, a chap called Franciszek Honiok, who had been sort of pulled up by the Gestapo a few days earlier and been sort of kept in a cell for the previous few days, and no paperwork. He didn't leave a paper trail at all, and he was drugged and then taken to the site of the Gleiwitz radio station and shot and left for dead. And it was his body that was supposed to provide the sort of irrefutable evidence that this was a Polish job. And that, I mean, really, the Gleiwitz incident failed. Really, they didn't make the announcement they were supposed to make. For some reason, that failed. So the technology failed them. So Germany did its best to sort of use it as its casus belli to provide the justification for the war. But it was the rest of the world didn't take the bait, and certainly the British and the French stood by their alliances. They duly declared war on the 3rd of September. They didn't do anything to defend Poland, but they at least declared war. So in that sense, the Gleiwitz incident sort of failed. But it's a classic case of a false flag operation, and it's a fascinating story.
And so it wasn't effective with the international partners of Poland, but how effective was it with the German populace? I mean, they read the papers, but do we know if they really believed it or not?
I think, on the back of this sort of drip of propaganda, as I mentioned, all of these sort of provocations, and Hitler needed that. Actually, he needed to be able to sell the war as a defensive measure. Hitler was he was frustrated throughout his career up until the middle of the war. Effectively, he was always frustrated that not least his own generals didn't really want to fight. He always said that he had to sort of lead them by the nose. That he had to take the lead, and that he shouldn't. He said he shouldn't have to goad them to go to war. It should be that they should be willing to do it. And he's always frustrated. And in a sense, the same problem applies with the German people themselves. This is a Germany that had lost 2 million people in the First World War, had lived under the shadow of the peace that followed, the Versailles Treaty, the territorial truncation, Germany's humiliation as it was seen. So the German people, and Hitler understood this, the German people wanted to see Versailles overturned, and they wanted to see Germany back in its, as they saw it, rightful place in the world, because all that's what the Nazis were supposed to deliver. That's what they promised, right? But the German people didn't want to go to war again in 1939. That was horrific. They'd only just recovered from the last war. So they wanted what the Nazis were bringing in terms of status, in terms of the territory back and so on, but they didn't necessarily want to have to fight for it. So this is why the sort of piecemeal approach that Hitler had taken up until that, with the Sudetenland in 1938, with the return of the Memmelland in 1939, all of which had been ostensibly peaceful. They applauded that. They loved the fact that he was getting those results, but without going to war. Going to war in 1939 for Poland or to take territory from the Poles was something that, if you'd asked them, the majority of Germans would have said, oh, no, we don't want to do that. So it had to be sold to them as a defensive measure. So this wasn't just sort of necessarily, propaganda eyewash just to get over an immediate problem of declaring war. It's rather more fundamental than that. That the German people themselves really didn't want to go to war. So you had to create this ruse to make it happen.
Well, the British and French response, the events you describe in the book, it's very interesting with Chamberlain and his response. It took them 2 days to declare war. How much did they need to be persuaded to do so?
That's a good question. There are a lot of misgivings on the British and French side, actually more so the French. The fundamental problem here is that both the British and the French had an overestimation of their own significance in this sort of trail of events. They had imagined, in the previous year, you had Munich in 1938, and then you had Hitler marching into the rest of Czechoslovakia or Bohemia in March 1939, and that's the point at which appeasement is dead. Even Chamberlain, the architect of appeasement, realizes that appeasement hasn't worked. Hitler's teeth haven't been pulled. Germany hasn't been satisfied with its territorial gains, and the policy is effectively dead in the water at that point. So even Chamberlain realizes that. So you switch to a sort of more of a policy of confrontation, where Britain particularly is sort of drawing a line in the sand, and you have this guarantee given to Poland and to Romania in March of 1939, saying, if you're attacked by Germany, we will stand by you. And that's the root of why Britain goes to war in Poland's name in 1939. But the British and the French, as I said, they overestimated their own significance because they believed that, as the sort of grand imperial powers and so on, that, if they just raised their voices, that Hitler would actually come to heel. And Hitler was way beyond that. He was way beyond coming to heel. So he was quite willing to call their bluff, which is effectively what he does. So the British and the French are basically saying, well, we'll just guarantee Poland, and that will stop Hitler in his tracks, because he wouldn't dare go to war, against us as well. And that's what they assumed would happen. So there's no real planning, certainly on the British side, there's no real planning gone into, what would happen if Hitler does attack Poland, what would we do? What would be the logistical situation? How would we respond militarily to that attack? So they're just expecting that Germany will do as it's told. So there's a lot of agonizing in those sort of couple of days, the 1st and 2nd of September 39, essentially with the British and the French. The French are more reluctant than the British, but the British, all of the sort of cabinet discussions that I've read, they talk a lot about British honor, and they say we have to stand by Poland because this is British honor. Otherwise, no power will ever trust us again. So they're not really talking about what we are going to do in defense of Poland. They're talking about, we just have to go through with this and declare war. So you can see that it's a sort of a moral imperative rather than necessarily a military one. This is just something that they have to do, and sort of what follows militarily will follow in due course. And as we know, most of that was not very much. So it's very interesting, that aspect, that I think they're constantly talking about British honour, that it's a reflection of our honour and our standing in the world, that we have to go through with this and declare war.
So almost the pinnacle of the British achievement was in declaring war, but not actually doing anything.
We didn't do anything. The French do something in response. They launched the Saar offensive, which from memory I think is about the 7th or 8th of September 39, and that is a land offensive against Germany. They attacked through the Saarland. I mean, it redefines half-heartedness, if we're honest. They advance about 5 kilometers. They're fired at by, the sort of rather hollowed out skeletal German forces that they face, and they stop. I think the death tolls are the death toll is sort of just about in the hundreds, I think, but it's minuscule. So they stop when they're fired at, and then they retreat again. So it's a really very half-hearted effort, but at least it's more than the British did. The British, to our shame, we had the capability. We didn't have troops on the ground in France, obviously, so that wasn't an option. But we've got the RAF. We had the technological will and capability to go and bomb Germany if that was the order that was given, and we could do it. We bombed German naval installations in early September 39, and we dropped leaflets over Germany, over West German cities, Cologne, Essen, and elsewhere, imploring the German people to cease and desist, being so beastly to the Poles. So we could do it, but the political will wasn't there to actually go and, bomb Germany, which is arguably what we should have done. So both the British and the French, actually, I think, utterly failed in their military response to the invasion of Poland. So,
and I do want to really concentrate on the Polish experience, but just on that British and French response, what had they bombed Germany? Could that have impacted the invasion of Poland?
To some extent, yes. It's debatable. I think had the French invasion been conducted with more vigor, and bear in mind that German forces in the West are absolutely stripped to the bone. They have very little in the way of air cover and artillery in the West, because they are stripped right down, because everything of any value is in the East against Poland. So they are very weak, effectively. The British and the French didn't know that. But had the French pushed the Saar offensive with more vigor, they could have made some fairly rapid gains, because I think that front was very, very fragile. But as I said, there's no political will to pursue it. So, essentially, as soon as they're fired at, they retreated. Would that have? And again, the same thing with the British. I mean, the British had they actually embarked upon bombing Germany. I said it was technologically possible, but there's no political will to do so. But had they done either the land offensive or the bombing, it would have naturally caused the Germans to respond by pulling some forces, whether that be anti-aircraft units or tank divisions, whatever it might be, out of the Polish theatre and pull them back to the west to sort of reinforce the west. So it would have had an effect on Poland. But I think, this is a counterfactual, so it's a difficult thing to sort of argue through. But I think one has to say that even in the event that both those things happened, I don't think, the best that could be hopeful really was that Poland's fate would be delayed rather than avoided, because I can't see the Poles, sort of turning the tide against the Germans on that in the Polish theatre, because they were simply up against too great a force against them. So even the removal of a couple of divisions wouldn't have actually made that much difference.
Right. Now the Polish army was pretty big, actually, wasn't it? It's around 1 million men.
Yes.
And
yes.
So obviously that's a significant force, but the impression one gets from reading the book is that as you've alluded to, it's also the knowledge of history as well, but you feel the Poles are doomed from the very beginning with the invasion from the Wehrmacht. What was their strategy? I mean, was there anything they could have done to stop it, to stop the Wehrmacht from their successful invasion?
Not much is the short answer. Poland, I remember I gave a presentation a couple of years ago to some military veterans, a couple of veterans of Sandhurst, who said we were amazed when I was explaining what Polish sort of strategic planning was in 1939, because they said the way they'd always been taught it was the Poles basically didn't have a plan. Kind of, it was that sort of classic, fools, not even fools on horseback, just fools against tanks. That was the kind of the way it was described, which I was quite shocked by. But no, they did have a sort of thought out plan. They had an Eastern plan and a Western plan developed in the 1930s, because they've got two enemies, Soviet Union at the east and the Germans in the west, and both the Soviets and the Germans have designs on Polish territory. Poland is re-established in 1918. Taking territory from both on the territory that it used to have back in the 18th century, but it takes territory from both the nascent Soviet Union and Germany. So it has two very real enemies on either side. So it has two plans. It has an Eastern plan, a Western plan. It can't do both at the same time. That's the fundamental problem. So it activates its Western plan in 1939, when it becomes clear that if there is going to be a war, it will come from the West, from Germany. And that plan was basically to have alliances with greater powers, with the Western powers. So they knew they couldn't defeat Germany alone. They couldn't realistically stand up to Germany alone. So they needed that alliance with Western powers, which they got, or thought they had at least. And from then on, it's about how you actually face down that German threat. And they know that the Germans are technologically better. They know that they are numerically better, superior, have better weapons and so on. So what they need to do is to engage German forces, first of all, and then execute a fighting withdrawal. So the engagement is necessary because the Poles were concerned, and I think rightly so, that if they withdrew to the sort of heart of Poland and basically abandoned those areas in the west that are faced by the Germans, that the British and the French would say, well, if you're not prepared to fight for yourselves, then why should we fight for you? So they wanted to make sure that war was joined, that the invasion was resisted. And then once that has been resisted, like a tripwire, once the tripwire has been tripped, then they would try and execute a fighting withdrawal to the sort of heartland of Poland, where they hoped to be able to sort of, create defensive lines using the rivers, for example, the Vistula, the Narew, the other great rivers in Poland, because Poland doesn't have much in the way of natural defenses. That was essentially the plan. But of course, the problem is that Poland is in its interwar iteration, in its form in the interwar period. It's surrounded by Germany on three sides. So East Prussia in the north, and Pomerania in the northwest, and Silesia in the southwest. So it's already, before a shot's been fired, Poland is in the jaws of a German pincer. So this makes the German attack really very easy, and they attack on all four fronts. So that makes life very difficult. And then, of course, the second problem is that the Germans are more mechanized than the Poles are. So they can always advance faster than the Poles can retreat. So once battle is joined, so that part works, the alliance is triggered, the British and the French declare war, but then Polish forces can't retreat fast enough. And they end up, in many cases, being routed and just retiring in disarray and being effectively encircled and destroyed by the Germans.
Now, there seems to be confusion between the senior command with the Polish senior command and their brigade and divisional commanders. At least that's the impression I got from the book. I'm not a military genius at that level, but it seemed to be leaving those brigade and divisional commanders, exposed to the German advance, whilst the high command sort of kept their strategy to themselves. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I mean, I should probably add, I'm not really a military historian either. I've embarked on this as much as anything to present a sort of it's like a non-military history. It's as much about sort of the fate of human beings in warfare as much as anything. So you don't get much of that sort of that sort of standard military history fare of the 103rd Division advanced 12 miles northwest to the line of the such and such river. I mean, that stuff bores me rigid, to be honest. So I don't tend to do that. But no, I think you're right up to a point. There's a real mixture of talents in the Polish army, and there's political reasons for that. So one of the problems they had was that they had this sort of political regime between 1926 and 35 under Pilsudski, who was the great sort of architect of Polish independence in 1918, and he came back as sort of a quasi-dictator with a coup in 1926. And the military was always his sort of fiefdom, and he promoted people who were, politically sympathetic to him. So a lot of those sort of senior generals and senior commanders in 1939, although Pilsudski had been dead for nearly 5 years, a lot of the people in senior positions were people who were there to some extent because they were Pilsudski's men. Either he'd fought with them in the First World War, or they had been, he'd been positively predisposed to them for some reason. It's not necessarily because they were the best men for the job. And there are a number of people like, General Sikorski, who becomes the later commander-in-chief of the government in exile, Polish government in exile. He was someone who was not in favor with Pilsudski, and so was in a very lowly position. I don't think even had a command in 1939 from memory. So there's this sort of political element there. So you've got people of very mixed talents in the senior echelons of the Polish army. On top of that, we have to bear in mind that Poland is facing a apocalyptic scene here, that it's being attacked by the most technologically advanced force on the planet, a force which outnumbers the Poles quite substantially, outnumbers the Poles in every category: tanks, planes, horses. Of course, the Germans have horses as well, men. And as I said before, the geographical situation means that Poland is already surrounded by the time a shot is fired. So it's really in a very, very difficult situation. So I often think, criticizing the generals for what they did in that situation is rather unfair, because I certainly wouldn't want to be, dealing with that rather catastrophic situation. But nonetheless, we have to look at that stuff. There are some generals that sort of do do a good job. I mean, there was Tadeusz Kuczeba's one who, the main sort of counterattack, which was the attack on the Battle of the Bzura, west of Warsaw. That was Kuczeba's baby. That was his idea, and it carried out very effectively. It was ultimately beaten back, but it was very effective. And then there are others, people like Bortnowski, for example, who, it looks very much like he had a nervous breakdown when the army that he was in charge of was basically encircled and destroyed. Understandable, perhaps, that you have no nervous breakdown, but you can see there's sort of varying quality there. The High Command, particularly, really, it's almost a sort of a bit part player, almost from day one. The High Command decides to move. Warsaw is threatened. The German spearheads reach Warsaw on the 8th of September, and the High Command decides to move to Brest, which is further east, about 200 kilometers further east, evacuates itself, and then in the process, of course, loses contact with almost every Polish unit in the field. So at that point, a Polish division or a cavalry brigade or whatever it is effectively fighting blind. They haven't got much in the way of communications. They don't know who's on their flanks, whether it's friend or foe, and they have no contact to the High Command. So it's an impossible situation. So I think certainly you would point the finger at the High Command, but then again, what else could they have done? It was just that, in a sense, they were fighting a situation, fighting forces that were too far superior to them.
So I hope that was enough to get you interested in part 2. That's going to be out next week. We'll talk more about the barbarity inflicted on the Poles. So join us then and give us a good rating if you enjoyed it.